Today's lesson is going to be about proportions and specifically using proportions to solve percent problems. So we're going to call this lesson percent proportions. First, we have to make sure we know what a proportion is. So a proportion is simply two equivalent ratios or rates. So I have the example here of 1/2 is equal to 5/10. We know that these are equal to each other, being that if we simplified 5/10, it would be 1/2. So these are equal to each other, which means they are a proportion. Now, there are three ways to solve a proportion, because it's not always, we're actually almost never going to be given all the information. We're usually going to have to find a piece of it. So the first way we can solve a proportion is we can solve them vertically. So I look at 1/2 and I know if I do 1 times 2, then I get 2. And I could do the same vertical multiplication on this side and it works as well. That's because they're equal to each other. When they're equal to each other, these ways will work. The second way we can solve a proportion is we can do it horizontally. And we could take 2 and we could do 2 times 5 makes 10. We also could have gone the opposite direction and done 10 divided by 5. But I like multiplication a little bit more. And horizontally on the top, 1 times 5 makes 5. Because these are both equal, top and bottom, this is a proportion. These are the two most common ways to solve a proportion. However, there are times when we cannot solve vertically or horizontally. And in that case, we're going to do what is called cross products. And in cross products, we're going to multiply diagonally. So if I do, and it doesn't matter which one you start with first, but if I do 10 times 1, that equals 10, and 2 times 5 equals 10. So the fact that we multiplied diagonally, we found their cross products and they're equal to each other, means that these two fractions or ratios are equivalent to each other, or they're in a proportion. So we can use any of these three methods to solve a proportion. So vertically, horizontally, or cross products. Most often students prefer to look at these horizontally or vertically, but when we can't solve it those directions, we do have to do cross products, and that's what we're going to work on today. So I've got 2 example problems set up for us now, and what I've done is I've left out a number, and I just put n for an unknown number. So just putting a variable there until we solve it. Now, I'm going to kind of demonstrate for these problems the different ways we can solve them. So coming to this first one, we would see right away that we actually cannot solve these vertically without having to go into fractions or decimals, and that's not a very simplified way. So we cannot solve this one vertically. We can solve this one horizontally. I can look and say, hey, well, 7 times 3 is 21, so 3 times 3 is 9. We successfully have solved this. All right, and I hope you remember kind of using some of these strategies and just working with equivalent ratios and rates the past couple of weeks. Now, I'm going to demonstrate cross products, and I know this wouldn't necessarily be the go-to people would go for right away, but if we kind of backtrack a little bit and let's pretend we haven't solved what n is yet, and I was looking at cross products, I would look at 21 times 3. And I know that 21 times 3 is 63. So when I do my cross product here, I would do 7 times essentially n, and we've done a little bit of that so far this year. And what would that have to equal? Well, according to proportions, that would have to equal 63, because when you do cross products in a proportion, they have to equal each other. So what we're going to think about next is, well, 7 times what makes 63? Or you could divide both these sides by 7. 63 divided by 7 is 9. A little bit more work, but as we get into more complicated areas, it may become the method you need to do this. All right, so that problem, our number equaled 9. Next problem. Okay, again, we cannot solve this one looking vertically. We could, we can't solve this one going horizontally either. So it looks like we're going to have to do some cross products because vertically it didn't work. I can't do 8 times, a whole number to get 20. So I'm going to look at cross products, and I would do 20 times 3 equals 60. And 8 times n, all right, well, that just equals 8n. So we need to know 8 times what equals 60. And I don't know that math fact right off the top of my head, so what's the best thing for us to do? Well, let's divide both sides by 8. And I say both sides because what we're doing is we're essentially creating this 8 over 8, which equals 1. It cancels out, and then we're just left with our n. But on this side, we can solve that problem. So if I type into my calculator 60 divided by 8, I get 7.5. And that's what n would equal. So I would like you to solve these two problems, and you can solve them in any of the 3 ways we've talked about, vertically, horizontally, or cross products. But pause your video now. I'm going to solve them in a little bit. Alright, so I got n equals 81 for the first problem, and n equals 40 for the second problem, and I used a horizontal solving method for both. How'd you do? Let's go on to the next topic. Now we're going to make this a little bit more specific to percents. Now the first thing we really want to think about when we're kind of writing our own proportions is that we always think about the number on top as the part and the number on the bottom as the whole. So as you encounter kind of word problems with these, really think about your part always being the numerator, the whole always being the denominator. The next bit of that is that you will often see the word is with your parts and the word of with your wholes. So I like to say it is part of the whole. I just don't include the word the just because it's not always needed. Alright, so in a percent proportion, really think about these words. I would strongly encourage you to write this down. Is part of the whole, and then let's add in the other side of this. And since this is a percent proportion, we have talked about this a lot the last couple of lessons. Percents are always what? Oh, I really hope you said something about 100. Percents are always out of 100. So I like to write it like this. It's like your percent over 100. So we're essentially writing our percent in that fraction over 100 form, but I'm going to use that fraction symbol up here. So if I can encourage you to write anything down right now, it would be this setting right here, especially for these word problems we're going to do next. Okay, so this is where we're really going to start setting up our proportions. So our first problem is 3 is what percent of 20? So we can kind of start it right away just by setting up our proportion bars here. And I like to do that right away, and then I just kind of fill in from there. So thinking about our is part of the whole equals percent over 100. I can start by putting in that 100 right here. And I always put it on the bottom right. Now, let's figure out what else goes where. So, since we're trying to figure out the percent is what percent, this is going to be our unknown. So, you can put your percent sign, you can put the N for unknown, you can put X, put anything there. I like to place something so I kind of know what number I didn't know to start with. Next, it says 3 is what percent of 20? Now, let's think about our proportion here. What is our part? Our part is 3. And a big hint is it says 3 is being the top or the numerator number, of 20. So 20 is going to go here. So now for the solving piece of this, remember we can solve vertically, horizontally, or with cross products. We just so happen to be able to do this one horizontally because 20 times 5 makes 100. So 3 times 5 is 15. So 3 is what percent of 20? And since it's asking what percent, our final answer would be 15%. All right, so next problem, let's start off with those proportion bars again. And I want you to pause this video and see if you can figure out what goes where before I go through it. All right, hopefully you took some time to work that out. I'm going to walk you through it. So this is a similarly worded problem to our last one in that it gives us a number and it's asking that what percent of another number. So hopefully you use the last problem to kind of help you set this up. It is a percent proportion, and in percent, if they're asking percents or they give a percent, we're going to need that 100. And that 100 is always the whole, so we're putting it at the bottom right. Then we would take, since it says 30 is the part, and we want it of 125, and that's going to go right here. So this is where we kind of need to figure out, all right, can we solve this vertically, horizontally, or with cross products? What you might notice right away is that I cannot solve it vertically. I can't just multiply 30 and make 125. I unfortunately cannot rework 125 and get it to 100. So I might be like, oh, let's like add or subtract to it. We can't do that. We have to multiply or divide. So this is going to become a cross products problem. To solve this using cross products, I'm going to begin by doing 100 times 30, and I'm just going to kind of use this extra space over here. That equals 3,000. Now, going the other way, I should have put my n in there, we would do 125 times n, which is just simply 125n, and then we're immediately going to try to figure out, okay, 125 times what equals 3,000. And the best way to rework that problem is to divide 3,000 by 125, because again, we're trying to get rid of that from this side, work it on this side. I would type it into my calculator, and we would find that 3,000 divided by 125 is 24. And since the question is asking us 30 is what percent of 125, we would say that 30 is 24% of 125. All right, let's try two more problems. I'm going to start off with my percent proportion right away. This time around, they have changed what information they give us. So they're starting off and telling us that 75% of what number is 48. So if we think this one through, and I'm really hoping we're very familiar with this at this point, 75% means 75 over 100. Anytime they give you that percent in the problem, I should see it written as 75 over 100. We're just writing it in that fraction form. Still remembering that is part of the whole equals the percent over 100. So the next, they say of what number, what makes it the unknown, so of what number is our unknown, is 48. So we can solve this either horizontally, vertically, or with cross products. Now, in this sort of problem, and this is what you're going to encounter pretty often, we cannot do it vertically or horizontally, so we have to use those cross products. So I can do 100 times 48, and you don't necessarily need a calculator for that one. Just remember that that's essentially 48 times 1, and then we have our 2 zeros for kind of those place values. So 100 times 48 would be 4,800, and that's going to equal simply n times 75, or 75n. But as with any problem, when we have an unknown multiplication, we can just divide it to find what to multiply by. So I'm going to divide both sides by 75, and I type in my calculator 4,800 divided by 75, and that equals 64. Writing it over here because there's a little bit more space. So 75% of what number is 48? Well, 75% of 64 is 48. Next problem is very similar to the one we just did. I want you to pause your video now, try to see if you can solve it on your own, and then I'm going to go over it in a little bit. I'm going to begin going over it now. Here's my proportion bars, I guess. I know that 120% means 120 over 100, even though 120% is more than 100, that's our percent. We write it over 100. Of what number? So of what number tells me that my unknown is my whole, is 72. That makes 72 my part. Looking at these verticals and horizontals, I won't be able to solve it that way, so I'm going to use my cross products. 100 times 72 is 7,200. Again, using that 1 times 72, including those two zeros. N times 120 is just 120n. What am I going to divide by? Hopefully you said 120, because we want to find n times what? So typing in my calculator, 7,200 divided by 120, that means that n equals 60. So once I divided it out, that's what I got. Alright, on the next slide, you will see two problems. Let's see if you can solve them. So pause your video now, give them both a try. I will show you my answers in a little bit. So I've gone ahead and I made my proportion for this problem. I haven't solved it quite yet, but this is the sort of problem I always try to look at vertical, horizontal first, and we can solve this one horizontally. I know if I start at 5, I can do 5 times 2 to make 10. So 100 times 2 means that our unknown number is 200. So 5% of what number is 10? Well, 5% of 200. Alright, so if you haven't gone ahead and done the second problem, pause your video now. I'm going to explain it in a little bit. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up my proportion. There was a little new wordage here that may have thrown you off. When we said 8 out of 25 is what percent. Now all of a sudden this is over here with the what percent, so that's where it gets a little bit confusing. But I hope you realize that when we say 8 out of 25, 8 is our part, 25 is our whole, and then our unknown is that percent part. So we can solve this one using horizontal. So I know that 25 times 4 makes 100. So 8 times 4 means that 8 out of 25 is 32%. That concludes today's video. Sorry, I know it got a little bit long, but I hope it helped. Don't forget to check out the notes and the practice problems.